Hi guys, I'm Maylin Dovan, certified athletic therapist and founder of Rehab-U Movement and Performance Therapy. Welcome to our YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed already, please make sure you do so and click the little bell so that you don't miss any videos. This week, I want to talk about shoulder problems that are not shoulder problems. And in order to start talking about that, I want to talk about the cascade of functional movement to get into a stable overhead position. Because most of the time when people come to me with a shoulder problem, they think it's because they are lacking shoulder mobility and they've done a whole bunch of online shoulder mobility programs and haven't gotten any results. And that's what I mean when I say, well, maybe your shoulder problem is not a shoulder problem. And so they may look at me funny when I say that, but they get it afterwards. So that being said, let's just go through what the cascade of functional movement is to get into a stable overhead position. I'm actually going to get you side to the camera. So as Caro lifts her arms overhead, she's going to get an easy like 170 degrees, but that last bit of shoulder flexion for her to get her biceps by her ear is actually an active extension. So her T-spine extensors actually have to be active. The scapula posterior tilters actually have to be active, okay? And because she's creating an sort of like an extension here in the upper torso, in the T-spine, she needs to have a reactive anterior core stabilization, otherwise she's gonna wind up extended, right? So she needs to pull that rib cage back a little bit to compensate and counterbalance. So she's got an extension force here and a flexion force here, right? Now, I could go, you can bring your arms down for a sec. I could go through like millions and millions of things, but that's essentially because, as you will see from an example that I'll give you later, that goes down all the way to the feet, okay? But essentially, the one thing that I don't want you guys to do that I did when I was young and just starting as well is as soon as I saw someone who was lifting up and then flaring and leaning back, I would say, okay, well, you're arching your back because you don't have mobility, so you're compensating by arching your back, so let's yank on your shoulders. But really, if I look at Caro, let's say she gets into that arch position, but I look at her actual shoulders, she's got good range. Maybe she just doesn't have the control over here, okay? So it's not an automatic, like you're overarching to get into that overhead position, that means you don't have good shoulder mobility, let's get you on a shoulder mobility program, okay? You will get people, so one of the people that came to me had a good shoulder flexion test, so he had a good position, meaning he could get his biceps by his ears, but he was still very rounded, okay? So his glenohumeral range of motion, his shoulder mobility wasn't that bad, but he just couldn't get out of this flex position. Now, I'm not gonna go into that case in detail because the kyphosis, rounded back, depressed chest, I've gone through that in many, many other videos and articles, so you can have a look in our, you can bring your arms down, in our blog and YouTube channel and find all of that. I want to talk about the person who perhaps is lacking that anterior core control, okay? The person who tends to want to form lock their lumbar spine to get stability. So as they get overhead, and usually it'll come out more with weight than without, but as they get into overhead position, they're getting that range of motion, they're getting that thoracic extension, but they're not able to control that in the front here. And if you take your assessment further and you actually look at their shoulder range of motion, usually you'll find that that's okay. They really just don't have that control. So that was a case of a client who had come to see me who said, you know what? I'm missing all my lifts, my snatches, all my overhead lifts. I keep having to drop the bar in front of me. And I've done so many shoulder mobility programs, and this is what he presented like. So he could get that range, but he couldn't control that extension. And he literally was leaning back. So when the weight was at the top of his hands, he literally was here, which means that if I put a higher load, he would literally have to drop it forward or he would fall back. So his issue was more of an anterior core stabilization, and it actually was also about the feet and also about the pelvis and really closing that can. So you know, when I talk about people who tend to want to get their stability by locking their lumbar spine, that means that the pelvis will come forward a little bit. So pelvis versus diaphragm, it's open, okay? It's not parallel. So what are some of the things that we use instead of yanking on his shoulders? Because I said to him, well, I'm not really going to work on your shoulders that much. We're really just going to work on you getting better proprioception through your feet, distributing your weight better on your feet, controlling your pelvis a little bit more, and controlling that anterior core and getting you out of that locked position. So there's a number of things that I did with him, and I'm going to go through all of them. But one of the important things was being able to get him into a bit of a flexion bias. Okay, so we're going to go through a couple of exercises that were able to get him into a bit more of a flexion bias, and then I'm going to talk about how we progress him during the time that he was working on his feet, because sometimes that takes a little bit more time to get awareness. Hey guys, thanks for watching our videos, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. So one very important thing when we want to work on that reactive core activation is initially we have to bring a lot of conscious awareness to it. For sure, we want in the end for him when he throws up I did a push press, a snatch or a push press, we want that to be we don't want him to have to think about it. But initially he's going to have to become very aware of it so that eventually it can become unconscious. So one thing that is really helpful for bringing awareness to that flaring, right, or that excessive flaring, is to kind of reverse a dead bug, or manipulate it to what we want to do. So typically when we're doing a dead bug, I'll give you the dumbbell in a second. So we have people have their knees and hips flexed, arms up, and usually they'll drop one knee and opposite arm, and that's the classic dead bug, right? And they want to keep this stable. Now, we're just going to manipulate that because what we want to work is on our client being able to overload his overhead position and maintain that stability. So we're going to get Caro, I'm going to stop saying him. The client was a him, but this is Caroline, the beautiful Caroline, who is stepping in for this client. So here we're going to overload because the upper extremity is usually not heavy enough to really give her a challenge. And she's going to do like a pullover, and she's having to control that anterior core. And come back, and then let's show them what we don't want. So what we don't want is for the ribs to flare as the weight comes back. Okay, so bringing awareness to what that feels like to keep that parallel, okay, to keep that can closed is a really good first step, something you would put in the activation sequence. Thank you. Now, we're always about helping our athletes continue to load and continue to train and keeping them as close as possible to their threshold of performance. So there are a couple things you can do or modify to the training to keep this person working overhead, but still bringing that focus to that anterior core. So what we want to do is get him into a little bit of a flexion bias. So what we can do here is we can do a single arm press with the other arm staying racked. Now we're going to show you guys with a couple of 12-pound dumbbells, but what's ideal is that the weight that's in front is heavy enough that it drives you actually into a little bit of flexion, and then so both at the shoulder, and then the other side is doing a press. So because this front rack weight is keeping her kind of tucked in a little bit as she's pressing over, she'll be less likely to hyperextend through the lower back or to lose that anterior core control. Okay, dumbbells, kettlebells, you name it. Okay, and we can put those down. And then I mentioned that we were working a lot on the feet, so the contribution of the feet to getting him into that good position. That being said, we still wanted to keep him, again, overhead pressing and have him be able to focus on that pelvis position and stability, pressing overhead and not having to think about the feet at the same time. So sometimes it's as simple as, let's take one factor out of the equation to make it more simple. So we actually can get Caroline on her knees doing a dumbbell press. And she can do one or she can do both. And now all she has to think about is the position of her pelvis and not flaring and getting her center of gravity in the right place. For example, not shooting the hips back, not overextending through the lumbar spine and shooting the hips forward, so working on that. And she can have variability rep to rep initially as she gets a feel for that positioning. But we've taken the feet out of the equation so she can really focus on the pelvis. So that's what I mean when I say to a client, maybe your shoulder problem isn't really a shoulder problem, okay? And granted, they may come in with shoulder pain or not. They may come in with deficits in performance in overhead positions. And so it looks quite a bit like a shoulder mobility problem. But when you dig a little deeper and you use your screens the right way, then you start to find the problems and you're able to better troubleshoot and find the best intervention for that person. Speaking about movement screens, make sure that you watch our video on movement screening where I explain what you use them for and what they're really for and how they can kind of guide you to troubleshooting and building your intervention and making it more effective, okay? So there you have it, shoulder problems that are not really shoulder problems and that cascade of movement that needs to happen and the different elements that can go wrong that you need to kind of look for in your assessment. And see you guys next week.